The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. Edited by Christopher Tolkien. Read by Martin Shaw. Akalabeth, the downfall of Númenor. It is said by the Eldar that men came into the world in the time of the shadow of Morgoth, and they fell swiftly under his dominion. For he sent his emissaries among them, and they listened to his evil and cunning words, and they worshipped the darkness, and yet feared it. But there were some that turned from evil, and left the lands of their kindred, and wandered ever westward. For they had heard a rumor that in the west there was a light which the shadow could not dim. The servants of Morgoth pursued them with hatred, and their ways were long and hard. Yet they came at last to the lands that look upon the sea, and they entered Beleriand in the days of the War of the Jewels. The Edain, these were named in the Sindarin tongue, and they became friends and allies of the Eldar, and did deeds of great valor in the war against Morgoth. Of them was sprung, upon the side of his fathers, bright Eärendil, and in the lay of Eärendil it is told how at the last, when the victory of Morgoth was almost complete, he built his ship Vingilot, that men called Rothinzil, and voyaged upon the unsailed seas, seeking ever for Valinor. For he desired to speak before the powers on behalf of the two kindreds, that the Valar might have pity on them, and send them help in their uttermost need. Therefore, by elves and men, he is called Eärendil the Blessed, for he achieved his quest after long labours and many perils, and from Valinor there came the host of the lords of the west. But Eärendil came never back to the lands that he had loved. In the great battle, when at last Morgoth was overthrown, and Thangorodrim was broken, the Edain alone of the kindreds of men fought for the Valar, whereas many others fought for Morgoth. And after the victory of the lords of the west, those of the evil men, who were not destroyed, fled back into the east, where many of their race were still wandering in the unharvested lands, wild and lawless, refusing alike the summons of the Valar and of Morgoth. And the evil men came among them, and cast over them a shadow of fear, and they took them for kings. Then the Valar forsook for a time the men of Middle-earth, who had refused their summons, and had taken the friends of Morgoth to be their masters. And men dwelt in darkness, and were troubled by many evil things that Morgoth had devised in the days of his dominion. Demons and dragons and misshapen beasts, and the unclean orcs that are mockeries of the children of Iluvatar, and the lot of men was unhappy. But Manwë put forth Morgoth, and shut him beyond the world in the void that is without. And he cannot himself return again into the world, present and visible, while the lords of the west are still enthroned. Yet the seeds that he had planted still grew and sprouted, bearing evil fruit, if any would tend them. For his will remained, and guided his servants, moving them ever to thwart the will of the Valar, and to destroy those that obeyed them. This the lords of the west knew full well. When therefore Morgoth had been thrust forth, they held counsel concerning the ages that should come after. The Eldar they summoned to return into the west, and those that hearkened to the summons dwelt in the isle of Eressëa. And there is in that land a haven that is named Avalone, for it is of all cities the nearest to Valinor, and the tower of Avalone is the first sight that the mariner beholds when at last he draws nigh to the undying lands over the leagues of the sea. To the fathers of men, of the 3 faithful houses, rich reward also was given. Eonwe came among them and taught them, and they were given wisdom and power and life more enduring than any others of mortal race have possessed. A land was made for the Edain to dwell in, neither part of Middle-earth nor of Valinor, for it was sundered from either by a wide sea. Yet it was nearer to Valinor. It was raised by us out of the depths of the great water, and it was established by Aula, and enriched by Yavanna. And the Eldar brought thither flowers and fountains out of Tol Eressëa. That land the Valar called Andor, the land of gift. And the star of Eärendil shone bright in the west, as a token that all was made ready, and as a guide over the sea, and men marveled to see that silver flame in the paths of the sun. Then the Edain set sail upon the deep waters, following the star. And the Valar laid a peace upon the sea for many days, and sent sunlight and a sailing wind, so that the waters glittered before the eyes of the Edain like rippling glass, and the foam flew like snow before the stems of their ships. But so bright was Rothinzil, that even at morning men could see it glimmering in the west, and in the cloudless night it shone alone, for no other star could stand beside it. And setting their course towards it, the Edain came at last over leagues of sea and saw afar the land that was prepared for them, Andor, the land of gift, shimmering in a golden haze. Then they went up out of the sea, and found a country fair and fruitful, and they were glad. And they called that land Elena, which is starwards, but also Anadune, which is westerness, Numenore, in the high Eldarin tongue. This was the beginning of that people that in the grey elven speech are called the Dunedain, the Numenorians, kings among men. But they did not thus escape from the doom of death that Iluvatar had set upon all mankind, and they were mortal still, though their years were long, and they knew no sickness ere the shadow fell upon them. Therefore they grew wise and glorious, and in all things more like to the firstborn than any other of the kindreds of men. And they were tall, taller than the tallest of the sons of Middle-earth, and the light of their eyes was like the bright stars. But their numbers increased only slowly in the land, for though daughters and sons were born to them, fairer than their fathers, yet their children were few. Of old, the chief city and haven of Númenor was in the midst of its western coasts, and it was called Andunia, because it faced the sunset. But in the midst of the land was a mountain tall and steep, and it was named the Meneltarma, the Pillar of Heaven, and upon it was a high place that was hallowed to Eru Iluvatar, and it was open and unroofed, and no other temple or fane was there in the land of the Númenorians. At the feet of the mountain were built the tombs of the kings, and hard by upon a hill was Armenelos, fairest of cities, and there stood the tower and the citadel that was raised by Elros, son of Eärendil, whom the Valar appointed to be the first king of the Dunedain. Now Elros and Elrond his brother were descended from the 3 houses of the Edain, but in part also both from the Eldar and the Maiar. For Idril of Gondolin and Luthien, daughter of Melian, were their foremothers. The Valar indeed may not withdraw the gift of death which comes to men from Iluvatar, but in the matter of the half-elven, Iluvatar gave to them the judgment, and they judged that to the sons of Eärendil should be given choice of their own destiny. And Elrond chose to remain with the firstborn, and to him the life of the firstborn was granted. But to Elros, who chose to be a king of men, still a great span of years was allotted, many times that of the men of Middle-earth. And all his line, the kings and lords of the royal house, had long life, even according to the measure of the Númenorians. But Elros lived 500 years, and ruled the Númenóreans 400 years and 10. Thus the years passed, and while Middle-earth went backward and light and wisdom faded, the Dúnedain dwelt under the protection of the Valar, and in the friendship of the Eldar, and they increased in stature both of mind and body. For though this people used still their own speech, their kings and lords knew and spoke also the Elven tongue, which they had learned in the days of their alliance, and thus they held converse still with the Eldar, whether of Eressëa or of the westlands of Middle-earth. And the lore-masters among them learned also the high Eldarin tongue of the Blessed Realm, in which much story and song was preserved from the beginning of the world. And they made letters and scrolls and books, and wrote in them many things of wisdom and wonder in the high tide of their realm, of which all is now forgot. So it came to pass that, beside their own names, all the lords of the Númenóreans had also Eldarin names, and alike with the cities and fair places that they founded in Númenor, and on the shores of the hither lands. For the Dúnedain became mighty in crafts, so that if they had had the mind, they could easily have surpassed the evil kings of Middle-earth in the making of war and the forging of weapons. But they were become men of peace. Above all arts they nourished shipbuilding and seacraft, and they became mariners whose like shall never be again, since the world was diminished. And voyaging upon the wide seas was the chief feat and adventure of their hardy men in the gallant days of their youth. But the lords of Valinor forbade them to sail so far westward that the coasts of Númenor could no longer be seen. And for long the Dúnedain were content, though they did not fully understand the purpose of this ban. But the design of Manwë was that the Númenóreans should not be tempted to seek for the Blessed Realm, nor desire to overpass the limits set to their bliss, becoming enamored of the immortality of the Valar, and the Eldar, and the lands where all things endure. For in those days Valinor still remained in the world visible, and there Ilúvatar permitted the Valar to maintain upon earth an abiding place, a memorial of that which might have been if Morgoth had not cast his shadow on the world. This the Númenóreans knew full well, and at times, when all the air was clear and the sun was in the east, they would look out and descry far off in the west a city white shining on a distant shore, and a great harbour and a tower. For in those days the Númenóreans were far-sighted. Yet even so it was only the keenest eyes among them that could see this vision from the Meneltarma, maybe, or from some tall ship that lay off their western coast as far as it was lawful for them to go. For they did not dare to break the ban of the lords of the west. But the wise among them knew that this distant land was not indeed the blessed realm of Valinor, but was Avalone, the haven of the Eldar, upon Eressëa, easternmost of the undying lands. And thence at times the firstborn still would come sailing to Númenor in oarless boats as white birds flying from the sunset. And they brought to Númenor many gifts, birds of song and fragrant flowers, and herbs of great virtue. And a seedling they brought of Celeborn, the white tree that grew in the midst of Eressëa, and that was in its turn a seedling of Galathylion, the tree of Tuna, the image of Telperion that Yavanna gave to the Eldar in the blessed realm. And the tree grew and blossomed in the courts of the king in Armenelos. Nimloth it was named, and flowered in the evening, and the shadows of night it filled with its fragrance. Thus it was that because of the ban of the Valar, the voyages of the Dúnedain in those days went ever eastward and not westward, from the darkness of the north to the heats of the south, and beyond the south to the nether darkness. And they came even into the inner seas, and sailed about Middle-earth, and glimpsed from their high prows the gates of morning in the east. And the Dúnedain came at times to the shores of the great lands, and they took pity on the forsaken world of Middle-earth, and the lords of Númenor set foot again upon the western shores in the dark years of men, and none yet dared to withstand them. For most of the men of that age that sat under the shadow were now grown weak and fearful. And coming among them, the Númenóreans taught them many things. Corn and wine they brought, and they instructed men in the sowing of seed and the grinding of grain, in the hewing of wood and the shaping of stone, and in the ordering of their life, such as it might be in the lands of swift death and little bliss. Then the men of Middle-earth were comforted, and here and there upon the western shores the houseless woods drew back, and men shook off the yoke of the offspring of Morgoth, and unlearned their terror of the dark. And they revered the memory of the tall sea kings, and when they had departed they called them gods, hoping for their return. For at that time the Númenóreans dwelt never long in Middle-earth, nor made there as yet any habitation of their own. Eastward they must sail, but ever west their hearts returned. Now this yearning grew ever greater with the years, and the Númenóreans began to hunger for the undying city that they saw from afar, and the desire of everlasting life, to escape from death, and the ending of delight grew strong upon them. And ever as their power and glory grew greater, their unquiet increased. For though the Valar had rewarded the Dunedain with long life, they could not take from them the weariness of the world that comes at last, and they died, even their kings of the seed of Eärendil, and the span of their lives was brief in the eyes of the Eldar. Thus it was that a shadow fell upon them, in which maybe the will of Morgoth was at work that still moved in the world. And the Númenóreans began to murmur, at first in their hearts, and then in open words, against the doom of men, and most of all against the ban, which forbade them to sail into the west. And they said among themselves, "Why do the lords of the west sit there in peace unending, while we must die and go we know not whither, leaving our home and all that we have made? And the Eldar die not, even those that rebelled against the lords. And since we have mastered all seas, and no water is so wild or so wide that our ships cannot overcome it, why should we not go to Avalone, and greet there our friends?" And some there were who said, "Why should we not go even to Aman, and taste there, were it but for a day, the bliss of the powers? Have we not become mighty among the people of Arda?" The Eldar reported these words to the Valar, and Manwë was grieved, seeing a cloud gather on the noontide of Númenor. And he sent messengers to the Dunedain, who spoke earnestly to the king and to all who would listen, concerning the fate and fashion of the world. "The doom of the world," they said, "one alone can change, who made it? And were you so to voyage that, escaping all deceits and snares, you came indeed to Aman, the blessed realm, little would it profit you. For it is not the land of Manwë that makes its people deathless, but the deathless that dwell therein have hallowed the land. And there you would but wither and grow weary the sooner, as moths in a light too strong and steadfast." But the king said, "Does not Eärendil, my forefather, live? Or is he not in the land of Aman?" To which they answered, "You know that he has a fate apart, and was a judge to the firstborn who die not. Yet this also is his doom, that he can never return again to mortal lands, whereas you and your people are not of the firstborn, but are mortal men, as Iluvatar made you. Yet it seems that you desire now to have the good of both kindreds, to sail to Valinor when you will, and to return when you please to your homes. That cannot be. Nor can the Valar take away the gifts of Iluvatar. The Eldar, you say, are unpunished, and even those who rebelled do not die. Yet that is to them neither reward nor punishment, but the fulfillment of their being. They cannot escape, and are bound to this world, never to leave it so long as it lasts, for its life is theirs." And you are punished for the rebellion of men, you say, in which you had small part, and so it is that you die. But that was not at first appointed for a punishment. Thus you escape and leave the world, and are not bound to it in hope or in weariness. Which of us, therefore, should envy the others? And the Númenóreans answered, Why should we not envy the Valar, or even the least of the deathless? For of us is required a blind trust and a hope without assurance, knowing not what lies before us in a little while. And yet we also love the earth, and would not lose it. Then the messengers said, Indeed, the mind of Ilúvatar concerning you is not known to the Valar, and he has not revealed all things that are to come. But this we hold to be true, that your home is not here, neither in the land of Ammon, nor anywhere within the circles of the world. And the doom of men, that they should depart, was at first a gift of Ilúvatar. It became a grief to them only because, coming under the shadow of Morgoth, it seemed to them that they were surrounded by a great darkness, of which they were afraid. And some grew wilful and proud, and would not yield until life was reft from them. We who bear the ever-mounting burden of the years do not clearly understand this. But if that grief has returned to trouble you, as you say, then we fear that the shadow arises once more, and grows again in your hearts. Therefore, though you be the Dunedain, fairest of men, who escaped from the shadow of old and fought valiantly against it, we say to you, beware. The will of Eru may not be gainsaid. And the Valar bid you earnestly not to withhold the trust to which you are called, lest soon it become again a bond by which you are constrained. Hope rather that in the end even the least of your desires shall have fruit. The love of Arda was set in your hearts by Ilúvatar, and he does not plant to no purpose. Nonetheless, many ages of men unborn may pass ere that purpose is made known. And to you it will be revealed, and not to the Valar. These things took place in the days of Tar-Keriatan, the shipbuilder, and of Tar-Atanamir, his son. And they were proud men, eager for wealth, and they laid the men of Middle-earth under tribute, taking now rather than giving. It was to Tar-Atanamir that the messengers came, and he was the 13th king, and in his day the realm of Númenor had endured for more than 2,000 years, and was come to the zenith of its bliss, if not yet of its power. But Atanamir was ill-pleased with the counsel of the messengers, and gave little heed to it, and the greater part of his people followed him. For they wished still to escape death in their own day, not waiting upon hope. And Atanamir lived to a great age, clinging to his life beyond the end of all joy. And he was the first of the Númenóreans to do this, refusing to depart until he was witless and unmanned, and denying to his son the kingship at the height of his days. For the lords of Númenor had been wont to wed late in their long lives, and to depart and leave the mastery to their sons when these were come to full stature of body and mind. Then Tar-Ankhalimon, son of Atanamir, became king, and he was of like mind, and in his day the people of Númenor became divided. On the one hand was the greater party, and they were called the king's men, and they grew proud and were estranged from the Eldar and the Valar. And on the other hand was the lesser party, and they were called the Elendili, the elf friends. For though they remained loyal indeed to the king and the house of Elros, they wished to keep the friendship of the Eldar, and they hearkened to the counsel of the lords of the west. Nonetheless, even they, who named themselves the faithful, did not wholly escape from the affliction of their people, and they were troubled by the thought of death. Thus the bliss of Westerness became diminished. But still its might and splendor increased. For the kings and their people had not yet abandoned wisdom, and if they loved the Valar no longer, at least they still feared them. They did not dare openly to break the ban, or to sail beyond the limits that had been appointed. Eastward still they steered their tall ships. But the fear of death grew ever darker upon them, and they delayed it by all means that they could. And they began to build great houses for their dead, while their wise men labored unceasingly to discover, if they might, the secret of recalling life, or at the least, of the prolonging of men's days. Yet they achieved only the art of preserving incorrupt the dead flesh of men, and they filled all the land with silent tombs, in which the thought of death was enshrined in the darkness. But those that lived turned the more eagerly to pleasure and revelry, desiring ever more goods and more riches. And after the days of Tar and Kalimon, the offering of the first fruits to Eru was neglected, and men went seldom any more to the Hallow upon the heights of Meneltarma in the midst of the land. Thus it came to pass in that time that the Númenóreans first made great settlements upon the west shores of the ancient lands. For their own land seemed to them shrunken, and they had no rest or content therein. And they desired now wealth and dominion in Middle-earth, since the west was denied. Great harbours and strong towers they made, and there many of them took up their abode. But they appeared now rather as lords and masters and gatherers of tribute than as helpers and teachers. And the great ships of the Númenóreans were borne east on the winds, and returned ever laden, and the power and majesty of their kings were increased, and they drank, and they feasted, and they clad themselves in silver and gold. In all this the elf friends had small part. They alone came now ever to the north and the land of Gil-galad, keeping their friendship with the elves, and lending them aid against Sauron. And their haven was Pelagir, above the mouths of Anduin the Great. But the king's men sailed far away to the south, and the lordships and strongholds that they made have left many rumours in the legends of men. In this age, as is elsewhere told, Sauron arose again in Middle-earth, and grew, and turned back to the evil in which he was nurtured by Morgoth, becoming mighty in his service. Already in the days of Tar Minastir, the 11th king of Númenor, he had fortified the land of Mordor, and had built there the tower of Barad-dûr, and thereafter he strove ever for the dominion of Middle-earth, to become a king over all kings, and as a god unto men. And Sauron hated the Númenóreans, because of the deeds of their fathers and their ancient alliance with the elves, and allegiance to the Valar. Nor did he forget the aid that Tar Minastir had rendered to Gil-galad of old, in that time when the One Ring was forged, and there was war between Sauron and the elves in Eriador. Now he learned that the kings of Númenor had increased in power and splendor, and he hated them the more, and he feared them, lest they should invade his lands, and wrest from him the dominion of the east. But for a long time he did not dare to challenge the lords of the sea, and he withdrew from the coasts. Yet Sauron was ever guileful, and it is said that among those whom he ensnared with the 9 rings, 3 were great lords of Númenórean race. And when the Olyri arose that were the ring-wraiths, his servants, and the strength of his terror and mastery over men had grown exceedingly great, he began to assail the strong places of the Númenóreans upon the shores of the sea. In those days the shadow grew deeper upon Númenor, and the lives of the kings of the house of Elros waned because of their rebellion, but they hardened their hearts the more against the Valar. And the 19th king took the scepter of his fathers, and he ascended the throne in the name of Adun-Achor, Lord of the West, forsaking the elven tongues and forbidding their use in his hearing. Yet in the scroll of kings, the name Herunúmen was inscribed in the high elven speech, because of ancient custom, which the kings feared to break utterly, lest evil befall. Now this title seemed to the faithful over-proud, being the title of the Valar, and their hearts were sorely tried between their loyalty to the house of Elros and their reverence of the appointed powers. But worse was yet to come. For Ar-Gimilzor, the 22nd king, was the greatest enemy of the faithful. In his day, the white tree was untended and began to decline, and he forbade utterly the use of the elven tongues, and punished those that welcomed the ships of Eressëa, that still came secretly to the west shores of the land. Now the Elendili dwelt mostly in the western regions of Númenor, but Ar-Gimilzor commanded all that he could discover to be of this party to remove from the west and dwell in the east of the land, and there they were watched. And the chief dwelling of the faithful in the later days was thus nigh to the harbour of Romenna. Thence many set sail to Middle-earth, seeking the northern coasts where they might speak still with the Eldar in the kingdom of Gil-galad. This was known to the kings, but they hindered it not, so long as the Elendili departed from their land and did not return. For they desired to end all friendship between their people and the Eldar of Eressëa, whom they named the spies of the Valar, hoping to keep their deeds and their counsels hidden from the lords of the west. But all that they did was known to Manwë, and the Valar were wroth with the kings of Númenor, and gave them counsel and protection no more. And the ships of Eressëa came never again out of the sunset, and the havens of Andunia were forlorn. Highest in honour, after the house of the kings, were the lords of Andunia, for they were of the line of Elros, being descended from Silmarillion, daughter of Tar-Elendil, the 4th king of Númenor. And these lords were loyal to the kings, and revered them. And the lord of Andunia was ever among the chief counsellors of the sceptre. Yet also from the beginning they bore especial love to the Eldar and reverence for the Valar. And as the shadow grew, they aided the faithful as they could. But for long they did not declare themselves openly, and sought rather to amend the hearts of the lords of the sceptre with wiser counsels. There was a lady, Inzilbeth, renowned for her beauty, and her mother was Lindoria, sister of Earendur, the lord of Andunia, in the days of Ar-Sakalthor, father of Ar-Gimilzor. Gimilzor took her to wife, though this was little to her liking, for she was in heart one of the faithful, being taught by her mother. But the kings and their sons were grown proud, and not to be gainsaid in their wishes. No love was there between Ar-Gimilzor and his queen, or between their sons. Inziladun, the elder, was like his mother in mind as in body. But Gimilchad, the younger, went with his father, unless he were yet prouder and more wilful. To him, Ar-Gimilzor would have yielded the sceptre rather than to the elder son, if the laws had allowed. But when Inziladun acceded to the sceptre, he took again a title in the elven tongue as of old, calling himself Tar-Palantir, for he was far-sighted both in eye and in mind, and even those that hated him feared his words as those of a true seer. He gave peace for a while to the faithful, and he went once more at due seasons to the hallow of Eru upon the Meneltarma, which Ar-Gimilzor had forsaken. The white tree he tended again with honour, and he prophesied, saying that when the tree perished, then also would the line of the kings come to its end. But his repentance was too late to appease the anger of the Valar with the insolence of his fathers, of which the greater part of his people did not repent. And Gimilchad was strong and ungentle, and he took the leadership of those that had been called the king's men, and opposed the will of his brother as openly as he dared, and yet more in secret. Thus the days of Tar-Palantir became darkened with grief, and he would spend much of his time in the west, and there ascended often the ancient tower of King Minastir, upon the hill of Oramet, nigh to Andunia, whence he gazed westward in yearning, hoping to see, maybe, some sail upon the sea. But no ship came ever again from the west to Númenor, and Avalone was veiled in cloud. Now Gimilchad died 2 years before his 200th year, which was accounted an early death for one of Elros' line, even in its waning. But this brought no peace to the king. For Pharazôn, son of Gimilchad, had become a man yet more restless and eager for wealth and power than his father. He had fared often abroad as a leader in the wars that the Númenóreans made then in the coastlands of Middle-earth, seeking to extend their dominion over men, and thus he had won great renown as a captain both by land and by sea. Therefore, when he came back to Númenor, hearing of his father's death, the hearts of the people were turned to him, for he brought with him great wealth, and was for the time free in his giving. And it came to pass that Tar Palantir grew weary of grief, and died. He had no son, but a daughter only, whom he named Miriel in the Elven tongue. And to her now by right and the laws of the Númenóreans came the sceptre. But Pharazôn took her to wife against her will, doing evil in this and evil also, in that the laws of Númenor did not permit the marriage, even in the royal house, of those more nearly akin than cousins in the second degree. And when they were wedded, he seized the sceptre into his own hand, taking the title of Ar-Pharazôn, Tarkalion in the Elven tongue. And the name of his queen he changed to Ar-Zimrafel. The mightiest and proudest was Ar-Pharazôn the Golden, of all those that had wielded the sceptre of the Sea Kings since the foundation of Númenor. And 23 kings and queens had ruled the Númenóreans before, and slept now in their deep tombs under the mount of Meneltarma, lying upon beds of gold. And sitting upon his carven throne in the city of Armenelos, in the glory of his power, he brooded darkly, thinking of war. For he had learned in Middle-earth of the strength of the realm of Sauron, and of his hatred of Westernesse. And now there came to him the masters of ships and captains returning out of the east, and they reported that Sauron was putting forth his might, since Ar-Pharazôn had gone back from Middle-earth, and he was pressing down upon the cities by the coasts. And he had taken now the title of King of Men, and declared his purpose to drive the Númenóreans into the sea, and destroy even Númenor, if that might be. Great was the anger of Ar-Pharazôn at these tidings, and as he pondered long in secret, his heart was filled with the desire of power unbounded and the sole dominion of his will. And he determined, without counsel of the Valar, or the aid of any wisdom but his own, that the title King of Men he would himself claim, and would compel Sauron to become his vassal and his servant. For in his pride he deemed that no king should ever arise so mighty as to vie with the heir of Eärendil. Therefore he began in that time to smithy great hoard of weapons, and many ships of war he built, and stored them with his arms. And when all was made ready, he himself set sail with his host into the east. And men saw his sails coming up out of the sunset, dyed as with scarlet and gleaming with red and gold, and fear fell upon the dwellers by the coasts, and they fled far away. But the fleet came at last to that place that was called Umbar, where was the mighty haven of the Númenóreans that no hand had wrought. Empty and silent were all the lands about when the King of the Sea marched upon Middle-earth. For 7 days he journeyed, with banner and trumpet, and he came to a hill, and he went up, and he set there his pavilion and his throne, and he sat him down in the midst of the land, and the tents of his host were ranged all about him, blue, golden, and white, as a field of tall flowers. Then he sent forth heralds, and he commanded Sauron to come before him and swear to him fealty. End of Side 1.